Good morning, I'm David Lipson. Let's check the day's top political stories on day 19 of the election campaign. The coalition to crack down on people smuggling, announcing a boat buyback scheme in the top end today. Kevin Rudd tries to win back the West, campaigning in Sydney amid more poor polling for Labor.
In the Sky News Centre, I'm Suzanne Lattimore.
And I'm Michael Willisey. Coming up this half hour, international condemnation after Syria's reported chemical weapons use and warnings the world could react with force.
Robert Mugabe sworn in as President of Zimbabwe after an election shrouded in controversy.
In first sport, Steve Smith's smashing centuries. Australia takes a strong grip of the fifth Ashes test.
In the weather forecast, showers in the southeast today, warmer in the east and west.
This is First Edition.
Good morning, you're watching our ongoing coverage of election 2013, where today the opposition leader is in the top end, focusing on asylum seekers with a new plank to his policy, which will see fishing boats in Indonesia bought back by an Abbott government before they can be used by people smugglers. Kevin Rudd is blitzing, meanwhile, the west of Sydney, starting at the markets very early this morning in Flemington. He's facing more bad poll results, as the Health Minister was asked about on the Nine Network this morning.
We've got 2 weeks to go. There are a variety of polls out there. Some are much worse than others. Some have us neck and neck. And our internal polling is a little different to the published polling as well.
Still bad though.
It's neck and neck, and it means that people really have to spend the next 2 weeks focusing on what $70 billion worth of cuts means to the services they value.
Okay. There's also a report this morning from one of the nation's top economists who suggests that the coalition is facing a $30 billion hole in its costings so far. That's the level of savings that it would need to make. The Shadow Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull was asked about that this morning on 9.
As Joe's been saying, day in, day out, this has all been costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office, and it will all be, the costings will be revealed in full when the policies are
midnight the night before the election.
Well, that's what you guys did last time,
you're going to be better than that, aren't you? So when are you going to do it?
Well, I'm not going to do it.
When is Joe Hockey going to do it?
He will do it in the last week, and I would expect early in that last week.
Well, joining me now is Sky News contributor Graham Richardson. Graham, first to the polls. The seat of Werriwa in Western Sydney even considered under threat, according to this Galaxy poll, a seat held by Gough Whitlam.
Yeah, although it doesn't really even resemble the seat held by Gough Whitlam originally. But I've got to say, the polls look a little odd to me. I had a look this morning. What you've got to believe, if you believe that Galaxy poll, is it swings in the same area, ranging from 2% to 9%. I think that's just too big a gap. One would have thought there'd be a much more uniform swing across Western Sydney than that, but you've got to believe it's 2% in Greenway and 9% in Werriwa. I'm just finding that hard to grasp.
What about in Queensland? We're seeing another poll suggest that Peter Beattie is well behind, but also in Kevin Rudd's own seat of Griffith, it's considered to be in play. What are the chances we'll see a repeat of 2007 when John Howard lost his seat?
I don't think they're really big. All the polling that I've seen on it would suggest to me that it's not in play. So I'm just bemused by some of the polls, but you've got to remember some of the polls are actually quite silly. If you stick with Newspoll, normally speaking, you don't go too far wrong. When Newspoll tells me that Griffith's in play, I'll believe it, and it's definitely not saying it. Labor's internal polling's not saying it, and neither's the Liberals. So, no, I don't really believe it is. But on the general point, David, I don't think Labor's doing well in Queensland. I had really always hoped that Labor could win 2. I think the optimists have been talking 6 or 7. That was always rubbish. But I thought Labor might win 4 in Brisbane. Now it doesn't look like they're going to. It looks to me like it might finish up being very much a status quo election in Queensland, which for Labor is very bad news.
Well, Kevin Rudd's hoping to turn that around today. He was up very early. He's going to be blitzing Western Sydney with a pitch to small business. He's talking about cutting red tape. for businesses that have to hand in their GST reports quarterly. He wants to shift that to annually for 1.3 million businesses. Can Kevin Rudd steal votes in this area that's usually pretty strong ground for the coalition?
Well, I'm not sure if he can, because I think most small businesses are pretty hard line against Labor these days. But that having been said, if there's one thing they love, it's not to do a quarterly BAS. And so it's a very attractive policy for small business. And I mean, as someone who's got to do BASs myself, I'd much prefer not to have to do it 4 times. So I might vote Labor as a result of this.
Also today, Saul Eslake, one of the nation's top economists, has suggested that the gap between savings and spending so far from the coalition is not $70 billion but $30 billion, still a huge amount. What do you make of that, and how significant is it, and can Tony Abbott make up that difference?
Well, it just shows you why they won't reveal the costings. They know there's a problem, and of course that's always been obvious. Now, Saul Eslake's hardly a Labor stooge. I think, along with Chris Richardson, is probably the best economist in the country, and no one's ever really seriously queried his stuff before. It'd be very hard for the Liberals to bag Saul Eslake, and I've always had a very high regard for him. And as far as I'm concerned, if he says that, it won't be far wrong. Now, 30 billion's not as bad as 70, but it's not flash either. And Tony Abbott won't feel very comfortable with this, but it just reinforces all of those suspicions that people have as to why the costings haven't been released. And by the way, if they've costed the paid parental leave scheme and everything's A-OK, why not release it? Why not put it out there?
Yeah, we're going to expect more pressure on that from the government today as well. On the coalition side today, a focus on asylum seekers, Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison in Darwin. They're talking about a scheme that would see fishing boats bought back by the Australian government before they can be used by people smugglers, and also informants in Indonesia. Local Indonesians paid bounties to sort of dob on anyone involved in the people smuggling trade. How significant a policy is this, and would that work?
Well, I just want to go to the auction where the people smugglers bidding against the Australian government. I wonder who's got the most money. It'll be fascinating to see. It's a very strange policy. I think that there should be more use of paid informants in Indonesia to talk about when boats are going. But that's so you can inform the Indonesian government and say, hey, here's another one, what are you going to do about it? Because at some stage, the deal that Tony Abbott will do with the Indonesians is not about turning boats back, because he knows that won't work. It will be about how much money we give Indonesia to do the job that we've always wanted them to do. In a third world country, stopping these boats is not, as far as they're concerned, a #1 priority. To make it a #1 priority, Australia will pay. Won't matter who's in government, but we'll pay plenty.
I just want to get your thoughts before I let you go, Richo, on what was dubbed Makeup Gate on Twitter and other social media yesterday, where the makeup artist before the People's Forum said that Kevin Rudd was rude to her, basically. How damaging is that, do you think, for the Prime Minister, considering the history of these sorts of events?
Well, as Bob Hawke said yesterday, this election is not about whether or not Kevin Rudd was rude to a makeup artist. But that having been said, the difficulty for Kevin Rudd is the number of times he's been accused of being rude. And they are too many, and that's because they do occur too often. I think at the end of the day, my father always used to say, you want to treat people well on the way up, because you never know how you'll be treated on the way down. I think that's something Kevin Rudd could well remember.
Richo, we'll chat to you again in AM Agenda at 8:30 this morning. Thanks very much for that.
Thanks, David.
Let's get some more information on that asylum seeker policy that the coalition is expected to unveil today. Our political reporter Laura Jays is in Darwin with Tony Abbott. What can we expect, Laura?
Good morning to you, David. Well, I can tell you that there will be a policy announcement today to the tune of $67 million. Now, this money will go towards supporting joint operations with countries like Indonesia, Malaysia and also Sri Lanka. It will include an international deployment of specialist AFP officers to those countries, and there would also be separately a special envoy to look at international relations and the international effect joint operations of tackling the people smuggling trade. As we have heard this morning, some of this money and some of this policy announced today will also include a buyback policy whereby the Australian government would buy Indonesian fishing vessels from poor fishermen that were perhaps looking at selling their vessels to people smugglers. There will also be a provision whereby Indonesians could be up for cash rewards if they provide information that leads to any arrest. So this is just the latest plank in the Coalition's asylum seeker policy. It was always going to be one of the biggest parts of this election campaign, and certainly there have been a number of announcements to date from the Coalition, and this is just another small plank. Now, in Darwin, you can't avoid the politics of these seats either. He's in the seat of Solomon today. It's a marginal Liberal-held seat by 1.8% by Natasha Griggs. He'll also be making a few local announcements as well. One aimed at defence families, one that he did make in 2010 as well, and that is to give free allied health services. The military vote, well, it always usually does fall or have a slant to the Coalition, but there's a Labor candidate certainly giving the Liberals a run for their money in the seat of Solomon. His name is Luke Gosling, and he is a former commando, so he's also trying to woo those defence families as well. That announcement to be made later this morning. Scott Morrison, the Shadow Immigration Minister, is here in Darwin with Tony Abbott as well.
And Laura, Tony Abbott was up early this morning taking part in boot camp, not his normal regime for the morning. How do you think he's looking? We're past the halfway mark. Does he still have the energy to get through?
Well, he does look like he has the energy. He looks pretty relaxed, actually. In media conferences, he doesn't really wrap them up until all the questions are taken. He's up most mornings with his very rigorous exercise regime, usually cycling or running at around 5 a.m. This morning it's a little bit different. It is a boot camp, but certainly as both leaders are, there's a lot of travel involved, a lot of sitting on planes and moving around the country, and I've got to say it takes it out of the travelling journalist. It's got to have an effect on the leaders as well, but certainly Tony Abbott looking pretty relaxed at this halfway mark.
Laura Jays, thanks very much. Well, I'm joined now by the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, who is blitzing Western Sydney today. Prime Minister, thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me on the program.
I want to ask you first about this blitz of Sydney today amid more bad polls. Is this election slipping away?
Well, the bottom line is the Australian people decide on the outcome of elections. And as you know, polls come and they go. The bottom line is a judgment. And a question for the Australian people about whether they support an approach which builds new industries and builds jobs for the future and protects jobs, and to make sure that there is a household pay packet, because if you don't have that, you don't have anything, versus Mr Abbott, who has a $70 billion hidden plan of cuts to jobs, health, hospitals and schools. And people will make up their mind about those when we get to election day, and we're just past the half-time hooter. And I haven't heard anyone call a game, whether it's in the NRL or the AFL, over straight after half-time. We've got a long way to go yet.
Your seat in Griffith is even considered to be in play, according to one of the polls today. Are you confident that history won't repeat and see what happened to John Howard happen to you?
I'm perfectly content to leave my future in the hands of my local community. That's what democracies are about. And the democracies are about choices, policy choices. One of those which is on offer today and in this week is Mr Abbott's proposal for an unfunded, unaffordable paid parental leave scheme. $22 billion, more each year than the Australian government will pay for total childcare assistance. He equates this reform with the introduction of the age pension, for goodness sake. So the big question is this: do people out there, as we get to the last few weeks of this campaign, are they going to be out there supporting and calling for a paid parental leave scheme which delivers $75,000 into the pockets of millionaires and sometimes billionaires for 6 months, while someone on the age pension is there on $19,000 a year? I don't think it's fair. I don't think the Australian people think it's fair. But this is Mr Abbott's captain's pick of a policy. And I think the last few weeks of this campaign are going to focus on his priorities.
You're turning your attention today to small business. What makes you think you can steal votes in this area that is traditionally a stronghold for the coalition?
Well, we believe that we stand for the little guy, wherever the little guy happens to be. Whether it's someone who is needing support through disability care, whether it's someone who needs support because they're unemployed and can't find a job, whether it's someone in employment who wants to have fair pay and fair conditions, penalty rates and overtime, and also someone who then decides to go out on their own and start their own small business. This is a great small business here in South Granville, here in Sydney today. And what I'm talking about is how do you take the red tape burden away from them more? 3 practical measures. One, with their superannuation obligations, to use the government's clearinghouse so that they don't have to deal with the red tape burden of that. Secondly, on the question of our paid parental leave scheme, to use the government clearinghouse for that. And thirdly, more importantly, for the compliance costs coming out of the goods and services tax for small businesses as well, a tax brought in by the Liberals quite a long time ago. But to reduce the number of times that they have to fill out that business activity statement, so that at present, if you're a small business with a turnover of more than $2 million, you have to do that 4 times a year. Our proposal is that if you're now with a business under $20 million worth of GST turnover a year, then you will only have to do it once a year. And this, I believe, is going to take a lot of the compliance burden out of GST compliance for small business.
Prime Minister, what about the little guy that works at Ford, with reports today that Ford's halted production in Geelong and Broadmeadows as a direct result of your changes to the fringe benefits tax arrangement? What do you say to those workers?
What I'd say is that we're investing $1.2 billion more in co-investment with the car industry than the alternative government of Australia, Mr Abbott's, is recommending themselves. So if you want to see a car industry in Australia at all, then, and the 50,000 workers who depend on it directly and the 200,000 workers who depend on it indirectly, then there is only one course of action, which is to get behind our approach. Mr Abbott is effectively saying, vote for him. That's the end of car manufacturing in Australia. We know that. Everyone in the industry knows that. I'm not going to kiss goodbye to 250,000 Australian jobs. I am fundamentally committed to jobs as the central issue in this campaign. We've built 1 million jobs over the last 5 or 6 years when the rest of the world has been shedding them. Mr Abbott seems to say he doesn't care about those jobs because he's got $70 billion worth of cuts coming down the road to pay for his unfair paid parental leave scheme on the one hand, and then pull out much necessary support for the car industry across the country. That, I think, is what people will make up their mind about.
OK, if we could turn to Syria. You said yesterday that first the priority was to establish the facts, but you also said that no civilised country can stand idly by in the face of the sorts of atrocities that seem to have happened in Syria. Would you consider committing any Australian forces to any international force that could be sent into Syria?
The responsible and careful approach to national political leadership when you're dealing with international crises is to take a calm and measured approach. Number one, establish the facts. About an hour or so ago, I spoke again with our ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Quinlan, and got an update from him about where the investigation processes have got to, about what was used, were chemical weapons used, if so by whom, and how many people have been killed or wounded by that. I'll be speaking to the UN Secretary General within the next couple of hours, and the UN's position now is investigators are within the country. We are now, as an international community, calling upon the Syrian government to give them full access to this most recent horrific incident in order to establish the facts. Establish the facts first, then decide upon the appropriate and most effective form of robust international action. I take this step by step. I'm not into the business of chest-beating announcements until we've established all the facts.
Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, thanks so much for that.
Thanks for having us on the program.
And for more on that story, Suzanne and Mike.
All right, David, thank you.
While the Prime Minister says he is seeking the facts, France has sent a warning to the Syrian regime that it may be time for the world to react with force if it's proved that President Assad has used chemical weapons on his people.
Activists say more than 1,000 people died following yesterday's alleged atrocity in Damascus, a city where government forces continue their assault on the opposition.
Shelling has been relentless. These pictures show the district of Ghouta near Damascus under another day of heavy bombardment. The skyline is thick with acrid smoke in this densely populated area. Yesterday there were similar strikes, but activists claim this footage, which has just emerged, shows rockets and artillery exploding into plumes of poisonous gas. The images of the aftermath are as disturbing as they are damning. Experts say these scenes would be almost impossible to stage. Many of the victims are clearly dying. Their convulsions a sign of advanced damage by a nerve agent. Even through the prism of the routine horror of Syria's civil war, this, if verified, is a new level of atrocity. It's alleged the attack targeted civilians as they slept. Many of them who are slack-limbed and losing consciousness are children. The French Foreign Minister says if this chemical assault is confirmed as the work of President Assad, the international community must react with force.
If it's proven for us, the position of France is there must be a reaction. What does that mean, a reaction? Not to send in soldiers. But a reaction, of course, of international condemnation, a reaction which could take the form, I don't want to be more precise, of force.
The United States made it clear 1 year ago the use of chemical weapons would be a red line. The Syrian opposition is now asking, if this isn't that turning point, what is?
Australian baseballer Chris Lane was murdered as part of a gang initiation, according to the father of a boy who knows the alleged killers and who called police when the shooting occurred. He has told Fairfax Media the three boys charged over the murder had been trying to recruit his son into the gang, but he had refused.
I don't think it was for fun. I don't think it was at random. I think it was the initiation.
Gang initiation.
Because I understand that after that happened, there's a list that so-called pops up with my name, my son's name at the top of the list, and four others they was going to bump off.
Veteran leader Robert Mugabe has been sworn in as Zimbabwe's president for another 5-year term. His inauguration comes after an election shrouded in controversy, with both opponents and international parties questioning the legitimacy of the July vote. The 89-year-old pledged to observe, uphold and defend the Constitution of Zimbabwe in an oath extending his 33-year rule to a crowd of thousands.
22 minutes past 7 Eastern on First Edition. Time for sport with Jim. And Jim, quite enjoyable night of cricket, a couple of days of cricket.
It started pretty slowly, didn't it? The English weather was the feature early on, but then the Aussie batsman got stuck in. One in particular, Stephen Smith. It has been a day to remember for him. Whilst it was a bit of a frustrating finish for his team overall, it was a good second day for Australia in the 5th Ashes Test at the Oval. Steve Smith starring on day 2, smashing his way to a maiden Test century, but rain and time-wasting tactics from England combined to see them reach stumps without loss as they chase Australia's 9 declared for 492.
After a long rain delay, Steve Smith and Peter Siddle headed back out to the middle. If the Australians had a plan, it didn't work for the night watchman, falling once again to